That is the version for if you are running the Sage HRMS and payroll version that you need to be on to make sure that that is in place then. And Nathan, thank you for starting the recording, as I missed out on that while we were going through the other setup things there initially. All right, so make sure you're on those versions. Speak with your consultant to make sure we get those in place then. Now, another thing for, again, if any of you are on Sage running Sage HRMS alongside Sage 300 payroll. So for instance, if you're using Sage HRMS for the HR components, but integrating that with Sage 300 payroll, you must be on Sage 300 2021 because of some changes in the Crystal runtime version that is newer in Sage HRMS than it is in Sage 300, and they have a patch to make sure that you are able to run reports in both Sage HRMS and Sage 300 in that instance. So if you are one of those and I just haven't heard from you, then that's certainly something to consider. If you're just using Sage HRMS payroll and have some other accounting system, that should not be an issue for you then. All right. One of the things that when we're talking about year end, something that or basically for any significant operation you might be performing, say an update or otherwise, when we do updates, the system will always ask us, hey, have you done a backup of your system? If you're in Sage 300 in administrative services, couple of things that everyone should be familiar with is this database dump and database load. A database dump is basically just another term for a backup. And so when I fire that up there, let me bring it over from my other screen here. You'll see it basically asks which database. So if you had more than one company, you could choose which database you're wanting to do the backup for here. So you can select each of those separately. And then you would click on the dump, which is just another, again, Sage 300's term for backup there in this case. You also choose then where you want that backup to be sent to and saved somewhere. So you could do that before you do any major updates or operations along the way. Now, in doing that, I would strongly recommend that you have all of other users out of Sage 300, because if you have people entering data still at different times along the way, that could make the backup out of sync. So for instance, as it's starting to back up, say AP, and it backs up AP and finally gets to the GL, but somebody has been entering and posting AP invoices along the way throughout that, the system could be a bit out of sync in the records that it has included in that backup for the various modules. So, but that's a way to do for any of the just you individual normal users who have access to that database dump function. That is something to keep in mind. Database load is simply what we would refer to as the restore. So that is basically the opposite of that dump. So if you had previously performed the database dump or backup, then the database load allows you to say, oops, I really screwed up something since that backup, and so I need to restore from that backup. And so this would be the way to do that. These are very, well, database dump, you could do that whenever and whomever can do the database dump, that's fine. The database load, on the other hand, is something to think very critically about before you would proceed with that database load, because that's going to overwrite where you're at that point with that database backup or dump that you did whenever time in the past that was, whether that be an hour ago or a day before or whatever. That's why you really want to consider, and so that's why we really limit who has access to this database load function. Database dump isn't really terribly critical or as critical because it doesn't affect your current system really in any way. So database dump and database loads are a way to do perform quick backups. if you are using the Sage HRMS system, because of the multiple databases in play there, that is something that actually has to be done in your SQL Server system, or some IT administrator would need to be involved in creating backups for you there. Now, in the year-end process, so again, when the agenda was talking about all these year-end close steps and year-end close checklists and all, as I mentioned in Sage 300, the beauty of it is that you really don't have closings to be concerned with, but there are other aspects that you need to be familiar with, and the ways that you can lock things as opposed to the term close. But one of the first things that needs to happen before you can begin a new year is to come into Common Services and the fiscal calendar operation, which I'm guessing most of you are, have been using it for a while or long enough. Now that we're at January 6th, all of you have done at least this step to create the fiscal calendar in the new year, which again here, so you can see my 2021 here has been created. I should create that. I could actually create 2022 right now if I wanted, and have that already available before I get to this year end to start 2022. But I've got 2021 here in the fiscal calendar, and that's the first step of starting a new year. Again, not closing my prior year, but ultimately starting the new year. And secondary to that, once I've created this fiscal or the year in the fiscal calendar, the second part of that process is to go here to the GL periodic processes over here, and I must run the create new year function to actually be able to post transactions in the general ledger for that new year. So some people wait until January to do that, January 1 maybe, to run that function. I suggest that you do that somewhere in the middle, at least in the middle of December, or if you're on a fiscal year, again, you may be, if you're on a fiscal year, say ending June 30th, I would suggest doing that somewhere in the middle of June or any time before you're actually going to post transactions in that new year. So in this case, we'll presume it's a calendar year. And so with December ending, I would have run this somewhere the middle of December. So that way, when maybe somebody is entering AP transactions ahead of time for the new year, maybe you've got rent checks or lease payments or something that have to be done maybe early on for the new year, you should definitely run that before that before those transactions need to be posted. Otherwise, you're going to have error batches in your general ledger. And so ultimately that create new year function, yes, does produce closing entries for the general ledger and your trial balance at that point in time. But the beauty of Sage 300 is that from that point on, anytime you're posting transactions in the, say, 2020 calendar year during that point, the system's automatically going to create any additional closing entries necessary throughout that time frame. But ultimately, the beauty is that it would preclude you from ending up having error batches because the 2021 year has yet to be created when you're posting transactions maybe from other modules. As I mentioned, there isn't a close function anywhere in Sage 300. However, you can see here now, I could come through, and some of you may or may not be familiar with this or use this, but you can actually go period by period, and you can see up there at the top, there's an option to unlock the column or the row, depending on whether you want to do all the modules for a month, or maybe I still need my general ledger open in a particular period. So I can literally go through each month there, or I can then, you can see, lock the entire row for basically a module. So whichever direction I choose to go, I can then lock those periods so transactions won't occur in that particular period any longer, again, as opposed to thinking of that as a closing situation then. So thus far, does anybody have a question that you have with what I presented thus far that we can address? Again, if you're needing to talk up top, there's the microphone that you can click to unmute yourself, or if you're on the phone, hopefully you are also unmuted. Otherwise, you can also put it in the chat over there in the chat bar then. So again, that being said, the beauty of it is that you don't have to worry about closing and then you are locked out of being able to do anything in the prior year, but you do have the ability as, say, the controller or otherwise accounting manager, where you can preclude users once you have finished a period. You can lock that down so you don't have to be concerned about whether changes to your financial numbers might affect a future or a period in the past that you want to be done with them. So that's the fiscal calendar and the create new year process, which is basically the solution to those year-end closings that you might be familiar with in other systems that you have worked with along the way then. So with that payroll update 73J that I mentioned, that does give you the new tax tables and functions for the new year with the new wage limits. And when you process the payroll and put in that check date, that's how the system, so when you're in payroll and you're doing the calculate payroll function, that's how the system knows which wage limits to use for that particular process that you are working with. So it's that check date being 2021 in this case now versus 2020 that it will know whether or not to restart the wage limits for Social Security, et cetera, SUTA, FUTA, and whatnot. But otherwise, similarly, as I was mentioning, there isn't a closing in for the year otherwise in payroll that you need to be concerned about. You might want to do a backup, but hopefully all of you have your IT people are doing nightly backups of your databases and your user files that are necessary. And if that's a question or you're wondering, then speak with them about that, or feel free to contact her consulting advisor, who would be glad to check that out for you and work with you through that. So the other big change this year, as I mentioned, was the product update that would allow for the new 1099 settings that have come out. And so there's there's really one change that needs to be made and updated, and I'll show you then how that affects the actual reporting. But once you have that update in place and not before, so if you're on 2019 product update 6 or older, or 2020 product update 3 or older, or 2021 without the product update, you will not see these new fields that I'm going to show you in the 1099 CPRS codes. So as you see here, I'm in AP setup, and I'm opening the 1099 CPRS codes. And if you're wondering, CPRS is basically Canada's version of the 1099 code. So that's, I'm not sure what PRS means, but I'm guessing C means Canada then. But ultimately, box 7 here, or non-employee comp, is the big culprit in this case, prompting the requirement for this change. So you will see when I pull it up here, maybe different than yours, depending on whether you have the update, there are 2 new fields here. This reporting type field, which now gives us a drop down. I choose 1099, and the amount type field here. So in this case, it's box 7. So I am presenting or changing that or setting that as non-employee comp. That way the system will know to send that to the right form. Now, you don't need to do any changes to your actual vendors. Now, in the, when you look at the release notes of these new settings, it talks about, yes, you could create all new codes. You could create a 1099 code NEC if you chose to, and then set these items. And then you would need to go into your vendors who are box 7 and change that accordingly. I guess I've been around the 1099s long enough that would be way too much trouble and problematic. And so I just would go ahead and change this here without having to change my vendors. And I would still know a box 7, just I know that's a non-employee comp, and box 3 is other income among others then. So this makes it much simpler to handle that change. Now I've actually created an import so I could, when I'm updating my clients, I've actually used this Excel spreadsheet that we can import into the system to automatically update those for you. You can see, I mean, most people don't use a lot of them, so it's not like it's really a huge ordeal to go through and change, the predominant ones of, say, box 3, box 7, or interest or something like that then, which is a separate 1099 that the Sage 300 doesn't really deal with directly. But ultimately, that's how you can go through each one and set that, or we can help you update those. So that's the first step that's the first step in Sage 300 after you have the proper update in place. Once you've done that, as I mentioned, the vendors would stay the same. That translation happens at that level. But the next thing or the other place that you would see it is when you go to actually print the 1099. So I'm in AP vendor reports, coming over here and opening the print 1099, 1096 form. So what you will see differently is, let me just switch this back to 2019. And once I do that, you will see that this part over here, this form right here, changed back to what the old one has always been, the AP 1099 Crystal Report form. Once I change that to 2020, you now see, because up here this drop down has changed, or is an addition right here, this form type box has changed to provide for the 1099 miscellaneous, which would be all the others besides the 1099 NEC, which will now, as you might surmise, only has really the one main amount that's going to be on there is the non-employee comp amount for those types of vendors then. So that drop down changes when I change that. Now watch, when I change it to 1099 NEC, the actual Crystal Report form here changes accordingly. So you can see now that changed to the 1099 NEC 2020 form. When it was up on miscellaneous, that said 1099 miscellaneous 2020 Crystal Report form. So you can see that change automatically when I just flip the box up here accordingly then. So that drop down between also then selecting the year, whether it be prior to 2020 or on or after 2020, we'll select the proper form there, and you proceed on with printing the appropriate 1099s for your various vendors then, and depending on which type of 1099 you need for them. So any questions specifically regarding that item, which is really the most significant new change that you will see if you've been around Sage 300 for a while? All the rest are the things that you've done regularly in past years. This is the new change that is different, and you need to be aware of going forward for 2020 and forward then. So that being the case, that is the extent of the items I have to present. We will be sending out, or actually, Nathan, if you would, yes.
Based upon what I see here, I think there's some people that are trying to ask questions that either their mic isn't working or whatever. Maybe you want to encourage them to use the chat.
Right, yeah, so there is the chat over there. If you can't unmute your mic, or I don't know if I can, yeah, anybody who's on the phone, I don't know that I don't have an unmute option. So if you need to type in, so you can click the little chat function up at the top for hide or unhide conversation. You can see the chat log over on the right. I'm going to post a couple of links to websites that are Sage 300 and Sage HRMS year-end updates. I see Lisa's typing something there, but they're year-end centers for Sage 300 and Sage HRMS, which has all kinds of additional links and checklists and even videos and other things for year-end reporting purposes. But you can see, have access to those links there in the chat as well. I'm waiting for Lisa to finish up her question there. Yes, Lisa. You don't know how many emails I've received. Hey, is there going to be an update for this 1099 change? And yes, we were waiting along with all of you as well to receive that. So Nathan, yes, Nathan will send you a link to the recording as well. So Nathan, put that on the list, and Nathan will also include those 2 links in the email he'll send out to those of you attending today, so you can access those accordingly then.
Yeah, that video will be shared off of our YouTube channel, and we'll send you guys that right afterward. And if there's any other content that that might come up between now and then, we'll include that as well. Randy, thank you so much. That was very informative. I really appreciate it a lot. Very detailed as always. Randy's one of our very best. He works with our Sage 300 team. We have some other great folks that also do as well. So if you guys need anything from us, please let us know. No matter how small, we're always here to help.
Absolutely.
Thank you for attending.
Yes, so I'll remain online here for just a few more minutes in case anybody else has any other questions that you need to type into the chat or otherwise, and we'll be glad to assist. Or as I mentioned, speak with your Kerr consulting advisor who helps you on a regular basis, and they'll be glad to make sure you have the proper versions in place so you can handle your year-end information in an effective manner then. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, Randy.